And Heart Sutra?
Yes, please.
Okay. Where's my Heart Sutra? Oops. Can you see that?
No, no.
Oh. Where that went.
There we go. I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time. The Bhagavan was dwelling on mass of Vultures Mountain in Rajagriha together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. And in the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element, and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the endpoint of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, and complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared Tadyata Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhisvaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagavan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom just as you have indicated. even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagavan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvati Putra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, ashuras, gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagavan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. So I thought, today we're gonna take a look at, we'll go talk about Goramba a little bit more at the beginning, and then we'll look at the kinds of things that are debated between the Gelugpas and Goramba just a little bit, not in depth, and we'll talk a little bit about, very briefly about TAKTSANG, and very briefly about Dolpapa, and then at the end I have a little bit of Mipam translation and also some passages from His Holiness. But we're going to start with words from the Buddha in the King of Concentration Sutra, the Samadhi Raja. It's one of the sutras that's quoted both by TSONGKHAPA and by Goramba, interpreted in different ways. If you analytically discriminate the lack of self in phenomena, and if you cultivate that precise analysis in meditation, this will cause you to reach the goal, attainment of nirvana. There is no peace through any other means. So, yeah, I stumbled on the discovery because of, working on the translation of Lamrim Chemo, that Tsongkhapa actually quotes these exact lines 3 different times in the, insight section. They're obviously super important to the point there, that you could consider in some sense the whole exposition of insight in his great treatise of 1402 as kind of a commentary on this verse. He doesn't say that, but he keeps quoting it over and over and unpacking it. And you can, if you read it line by line, you can see he starts by talking about analytical discrimination. So there's an importance of thinking and analysis and logic. And what is it you're using to do is to identify the lack of self in phenomena. It's not to identify that everybody was a Buddha from the very beginning. And then if you cultivate that precise analysis, in other words, not you do this analysis and then, that clears the way for you to meditate on something else, like your primordial pristine Buddha nature. Now you cultivate in meditation exactly that which you have understood through analysis. And, that's precisely what Tsongkhapa's argument is. And then, of course, it says, this is the only way that you'll ever reach freedom from cyclic existence. So you can see maybe why Tsongkhapa would favor that passage and want to drum it into people's heads, both his supporters and his his potential opponents. And then I thought to also pull out these words from Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa tells us at the beginning of the Great Treatise on the Stages of the Path to Enlightenment to treat everything in, you know, the Buddha's word as personal instruction. In other words, it's not like there's, you know, these erudite texts by Nagarjuna and then there's the personal instructions which are about something different. In his understanding, the spiritual guidance of the teacher is guidance in understanding, studying, meditating on, you know, thinking about, reflectively introspectively understanding exactly that which you've studied, right? So he understands that that's difficult, but he says, yeah, you should still approach the teachings, even when they're philosophically complex, as that they're personal instructions. And so sometimes in the book, it gets very technical, and other times he just talks to the readers, you know, like he's talking right to them, like he's our Lama. My friends who study the profound Madhyamaka texts, although it's hard for you to posit dependent arising of cause and effect within the absence of inherent existence, it's better to take the approach of saying, such is the Madhyamaka system. In other words, even if you don't fully understand it, right, you should recognize that this is the system that we're trying to understand and penetrate, rather than the other approach, right, which is changing your idea about what Madhyamaka is to fit what you're right now capable of understanding. Because otherwise you will not be able to escape the faults that you've stated to others, and you will find yourself drawn into a non-system. The paradox, one of the paradoxes he's thinking about is like that if people do this analysis and a deconstruction of the self, and they think that that means that all these things don't exist at all and are just sheer products of sheer delusion, all right? And then they realize that that analysis equally applies to themselves as the analyzer of things. They will be stuck in a quandary of not knowing what to think. How can this analysis take place if the analyzer, just like the analyzed phenomena, are complete products of delusion, right, all along? And so he said this is what leads people into not really having a philosophical system or a view. You might still have a practice of generosity and ethical discipline and so forth, but they can't cultivate a view if their understanding of the view, it can't reconcile emptiness and dependent arising. So if you get into that system, you know, that situation where you can't really make sense out of it, he says, continue to study. And in volume 1, much earlier in the Great Treatise, he has this really clever quote from one of the Gadamba masters who says, it really doesn't matter if you are ashamed of the fact you've only read one handbook on how to meditate, or if you're bragging about the fact that you've only read one handbook on meditating. Either way, you'll have to read a yak's load of books before you become a Buddha, right? So of course, Tsongkhapa loves that quote too, it's very Gelugpa. Yeah, so we were talking about Goramba in the first several slides. I mean, I don't know whether we have to sort of review that view and explore it a little bit. I had this slide last time that, you know, Goramba believes that all the Sakya scholars, including Rendao, who was Tsongkhapa's teacher, have this same understanding of Madhyamaka that he's articulating. And he argues that in Nagarjuna's texts, there are two types of emptiness that are talked about: the emptiness of rational analysis and the emptiness of individual yogic knowledge. It's very interesting. You see, well, this is already like a contrast with what we just were reading in the Samadhi Raja Sutra, right? Because he's saying there's something that a kind of emptiness of self that you'll realize through analysis. But then there's a different or other or distinct, let's say that's fair. There's a distinct emptiness, which is realized by yogis in meditation. Not the same thing. And for Goramba, yogic emptiness for him is emptiness that's realized in an indescribable way by the sublime wisdom of Arya's personal yogic knowledge. Yeah, some of this is translations from Goramba. This is called ultimate truth. We call it the ultimate truth, but words cannot teach it in terms of any extreme, right? Where something extra is being constructed, such as it exists or it doesn't exist, or it's eternalism or nihilism, or it's empty or non-empty. So you can see Goramba thinks that why the Gelugpas are, he argues that they're nihilists because they're grasping onto an extreme from his point of view, and that is that the ultimate truth is empty, instead of letting go of attachment to all extremes, including exist, non-exist, and empty, non-empty, right? So this profound reality, the yogic emptiness, transcends the reference of any conventional terms. And it is the real nature, it's the ultimate reality, means it's the basic nature, the profound reality of illusion-like dependent arisings. No matter how they appear, there isn't anything that has any other way of existing except this indescribable freedom from the extremes of different kinds of elaborations. That's the kind of way he talks about, like something, there's not extra dualistic categories being added on. So Goramba spends most of his time criticizing Tsongkhapa because Tsongkhapa was really catching on big. His ideas were having a huge impact during Goramba's lifetime, and he was pushing back hard. But in the previous generation, the philosophical fashion that Tsongkhapa and his teacher Rendao were reacting against was the fashion for extrinsic emptiness, which, as I mentioned, still goes on down to today. And so Goramba also wants to criticize that. He just doesn't spend as much time on criticizing it, but he thinks it's terrible. He doesn't spend as much time on it, not because he thinks it's less bad. He thinks it's just less important at that particular historical moment. I think he almost feels like anybody should be able to figure out that this extrinsic emptiness is absurd, whereas many reasonable people could fall prey in Goramba's estimation to Tsongkhapa's views. So the system of Dolpapa, this extrinsic emptiness, falls outside the purport of the Mahayana Sutras, the commentaries, as well as Chittamatra and Madhyamaka philosophical systems. So Tsongkhapa says that the root of all faults is the conception of truth, that grasp at things as true, and it's therefore necessary to repudiate the constructed object of that conception of true existence. And that's quite correct. So that's the part he agrees with. You have to realize the emptiness of self. However, it goes on to claim that the actual ultimate truth, the profound reality, really three visions of profound reality. Goramba's vision of profound reality is that the profound reality that is the mode of existence and the ultimate truth for all phenomena is not a mere negation, right? And so this is the part that where he thinks that Tsongkhapa goes astray. They claim that the actual ultimate truth is just an utter negation, an emptiness that is the mere absence of a truth that can be found when sought by reason. So that does describe Tsongkhapa's view, and he thinks it's a bad view. I was sitting with a colleague, a scholar, who has spent most of his time studying Mipam. but you know, who is the greatest philosopher of Nyingma and lived in the 19th century. And he was learning, you know, as I've been learning about non-Gelugpa systems, he was coming from the other side and trying to learn about Gelugpa systems. And he was talking to Geshe Yeshe Tupke, you know, who is a Losaling, Drabung Losaling scholar. And he was very surprised to understand that in Gelugpa, the object that you're meditating on analytically is the same object, the same emptiness that you realize on the path of seeing when you attain nirvana. For him, following the kind of thinking that you see here, it has to be something different. And it was hard for him to understand that in the Gelugpa way, it's the same emptiness. It's just that the mode of apprehending it from the subjective side is different, but the content is the same. And that's the Gelugpa's claim that the manifest conceptualization of emptiness. So that's a kind of like pejorative way to say the mind realizing emptiness conceptually, right? You know, which, gosh, that would be good to have. What he's sort of saying, you know, is like, well, it's good to have, but not so good, right? Because as soon as you have this idea, oh, things are really empty, what you need to do is free yourself from attachment to that. And of course, that is, Tsongkhapa spends quite a bit of time saying, no, that's not the case. You should be happy that you've understood emptiness and realize that that applies to everything, including, you know, yourself and your own views. But you shouldn't therefore think, I need to refute my view of emptiness along with my view of non-emptiness, right? And that's exactly what Goramba does think, right? So he thinks that that is what the whole Madhyamaka tradition coming from India says, and that this is where Tsongkhapa goes astray, a crucial point where he goes astray. So the actual ultimate truth is not, you know, the emptiness that we understand conceptually for Goramba. It transcends the mental objects of ordinary beings, and even the stainless sublime wisdom of an Arya's meditative equipoise that loses all dualistic appearances of it and does not see it in terms of any extreme, such as existence, non-existence, eternalism, or nihil. So Tsongkhapa would probably agree with the idea that the mode of apprehending, the way of that the subject, the mind is operating in the meditative equipoise on emptiness is quite different and involves the vanishing of any subject-object duality, any sense, therefore, of any difference between the mind realizing emptiness and emptiness that's being realized. It's devoid of any concept of emptiness. It's devoid of any kind of reification of emptiness as existing or non-existing. Tsongkhapa says this. It's like you say, well, meditative equipoise, a yogi meditating on emptiness realizes emptiness, but it doesn't realize the existence of emptiness, because the existence of emptiness is not emptiness, and it is only emptiness is realized by this mind. So when do you first really, really, really know that emptiness exists, right? Well, you know it based on direct experience in the post-meditative state on the path of seeing. Of course, you know it inferentially before that, but to know it based on perception is something that you emerge from meditation, realizing emptiness, to say, oh, I just saw emptiness, right? And that's not something that you're thinking while you're in that meditative equipoise. So this is, a famous quote from Shantideva that Gelugpas have to interpret, and explain. It seems on the surface to say that the ultimate isn't something that is knowable, But of course, you know, Tsongkhapa has his own way of explaining this. It's not the domain of dualistic awareness or, right. So he thinks that correct perception refers to an Arya's stainless meditative equipoise, and all worldly awareness is a false perception. Therefore, we classify as a conventional truth the utterly negative emptiness that's explicitly apprehended by an inferential reasoning conscious looking for truth, true existence, that means, and failing to find it. In other words, when we're meditating in emptiness, and if we realize it through reasoning and inference, that which we are realizing is actually a conventional truth, not an ultimate truth, according to GORAMPA, right? Because it doesn't. It isn't the final mode of abiding of things. It is an important thing to realize because it clears the way for, in turn, letting go of your grasping attachment to what that mind itself has realized, that is emptiness, and therefore becoming free from both emptiness and non-emptiness. That's how he understands it, right? Different from what we're used to. So Tsongkhapa counts as an actual ultimate truth, the direct object of a mind that's apprehending the lack of true existence after using reason, right? And, you know, I think I said last time, Koram, this is absurd. It's like claiming that a mental image of the ultimate truth is the ultimate truth. Tsongkhapa doesn't say that a mental image of the ultimate truth is the actual ultimate truth. He doesn't say that. But you're getting at or understanding emptiness through the dualistic medium of the mental representation in Tsongkhapa's way of explaining it. But Karma says, well, you know, you're just getting at this mental image of emptiness, like spaciousness or something, and you're taking that as though it were the actual ultimate truth, when it can't be, because the actual ultimate truth is beyond any conceptualization. Right. So his system refers to Tsongkhapa as criticized by Goramba. And then he has some sutra things to back up his point of view. When bodhisattvas think these aggregates are empty, they're still involved with signs, which means reified characteristics, and they lack faith in the unborn state. So when you're thinking these aggregates are empty, you're not actually getting at the ultimate truth. Because the ultimate truth, that's how Goramba reads this. Ultimate truth is something that transcends any reified characteristic, including the characteristic of being identified as empty. Yeah. And another one says, when one uses the expression form is empty, one's using sign. When one's using the expression form is not empty, one is using signs, right? And signs here again means, like, you know, you're relying on a reified characteristic, so you're not actually getting at the perfection of wisdom itself. So Goramba introduces kind of a rebuttal from Tsongkhapa's point of view, and which says all these Perfection Wisdom Sutra quotes mean that you should negate the apprehension of emptiness as truly existent, but they don't indicate that you should negate the apprehension of the emptiness that's the negation of truth. In other words, don't get rid of your understanding that things are empty and think that that itself needs to be criticized. Just don't take that as truly existent. What knowing emptiness means that nothing is truly existent, including your own apprehension of emptiness. So that would be Tsongkhapa's view. And, you know, Goramba is quite harsh. I have not made a point of finding all the meanest things that he says about Tsongkhapa, but he does say some fairly mean things, which is relevant to something I'm going to explain later. So yeah, these demonic words degrade the freedom from elaborations. That's what he considers the profound reality, freedom from elaborations. That's the heart of the Dharma. They're deceptive sloganeering of those with little intelligence and little merit. Now that's pretty bad thing to say. Yeah, not too ecumenical there. Yeah. If this were true, it would be pointless for passages, you know, in the sutras to use pluralizing expressions. This is what Karma says. Like it says, you know, you have to overcome all views. You have to eliminate every conceptualization. You have to, you know, let go of every view. And it's like, in other words, there are multiple views that need to be let go of, right? And, you know, there would be no need for a plural if the only view that you needed to get rid of was the view that things are truly existent, right? That's his argument. He also thinks, you know, when Tsongkhapa reads things like, you know, things are neither existent nor non-existent, or in the Heart Sutra it says, right, they're neither stainless nor neither stained nor devoid of stain. They're neither fulfilled nor incomplete. You say, you know, it's wrong to explain, as Tsongkhapa and the Gelugpas do, that to say neither existent nor non-existent means ultimately not being existent, but conventionally not being non-existent. And that is the way Gelugpas would explain it, maybe. It's consistent with the Gelugpa explanation, right? But of course, Karma doesn't think that that's right. Actual freedom from elaborations of the four extremes, that means, you know, existing, not existing, both and neither, is the perspective of the sublime wisdom. Actual freedom from elaborations, all four extremes. It's not, you know, not existent in one way and, you know, non-existent from another point of view. So he has a quote from a Indian text that says, when you're negating existence, non-existence, both and neither, the thing that you're negating and in relationship to is a consciousness, right? This consciousness that knows reality is neither existent nor non-existent nor both nor neither, according to this Shastra. And then his argument was, well, if, you know, since it's clear that the thing that you're talking about that is said to be neither existent nor non-existent is a consciousness, right? Then Tsongkhapa's interpretation, you know, it isn't correct, because he's saying you should take existence and non-existence and both and neither, and then refute the true existence of each of those, right? He's saying, well, that's not what the actual Madhyamaka sources from India are saying, right? And then he puts in an imperative. So he has some strong feelings about this, that people really need to think about his ideas. So yeah, what does the word emptiness mean for Karamba? He says sometimes Madhyamikas you mean the lack of true existence, but they also can use it to mean the lack of elaboration of all four extremes. So he's saying there is an emptiness that is, you know, what Tsongkhapa's talking about, but that's not the profound reality that that you realize on the path of seeing when you realize nirvana. The emptiness, that's the lack of true existence, is something that, you know, all Buddhist practitioners have in common as an object to be realized. Whereas the profound reality that's like a lack of any kind of elaboration whatsoever, as empty or not empty or existent or non-existent, that's something that's only found in Mahayana philosophy. So like he's being a prasangika, right? He's saying that, of course, you know, you don't have to be a Mahayana practitioner to realize emptiness, but you're realizing the more superficial kind of emptiness You're not realizing the freedom from elaborations. Anything that's called the real nature, the reality element, that's Chirying, or the Dharma Dhatu. Real nature, I think, is Chirni or Teishini. Freedom from elaborations is a key term, right? It means like separate from anything extra, that's any reified categories being added on to things just as they are. Or non-dual union. These are free from the elaborations of all four extremes, and non-Mahayana practitioners don't know these at all. That's what's characteristic. So in other words, he's kind of saying that Tsongkhapa has a Buddhist view, but it's not a Mahayana Buddhist view. It's a philosophy that belongs in a non-Mahayana tenet system. And he has quotes supporting that. Let's see, something is going on with my computer. There you go. This is an interesting one because, it's referenced by Tsongkhapa, Nagarjuna. I've explained that while the way to be free from taking up views is emptiness, someone who holds emptiness as the only view is incurable. So this is in the 24th chapter of the Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way, a direct reference to this passage from Sutra. And of course, it's obvious that Goramba would take this as being precisely the mistake that Tsongkhapa has made. So he has another perfection of wisdom. It's called emptiness, but it does not exist. Call it emptiness, but do not apprehend it, right? So, if you're Gelugpa, we're reading and we say, it's called emptiness, but it does not inherently exist. Call it emptiness, but do not apprehend it, dualistically, or do not apprehend it as truly existent or something like that. By the way, in the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment, Tsongkhapa has a section where he talks about why it is justified to add in adverbs like ultimately or truly existent or inherently into passages like this where it's not stated. And what he argues is he can find in all of these texts places where the qualification inherently, right, or truly existent is added to the negation. So it's not a sheer negation, right? It's qualified. But then once it's been qualified in one part of the text, it doesn't have to be then again qualified throughout. He even has a quote from Sutra where Buddha says, when I said that things don't exist, I meant that they don't exist inherently. So in other words, Tsongkhapa has his own quotes that back up and justify his use of these qualifying adverbs. And then this is a really peculiar one. Anyone has heard of the text, The Questions of the Bodhisattva Horse Voice? Not only have I tried to figure out what this text is, but Thupten Jimba has tried as well. And we don't know what this text is, but Goramba quotes it as, as a sutra, having the Buddha say that people can be nihilistic in three different ways. You can be a nihilist by denying even conventional existence to cause and effect of actions. You can be a nihilist by being exclusively attached to the position of non-existence, or without knowing the profound dharma that's freedom from elaborations, you're attached to the word empty, right? So obviously he quotes that because he thinks this backs up his view that the Gelugpas have fallen into nihilism with regard to their view of the ultimate reality. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the path for Goramba because, there's a lot of differences, but there's a lot of similarities too. This is all translation for Goramba. The critical point is that in Mahayana one finds a special view that's free of every dualistic notion of the nature of reality as existing, not existing, and so forth. So if you just take that on its face and set aside what Goramba thinks it means, I think Tsongkhapa could agree with that, the view. Compassion regarding living beings and aspiration to Mahayana awakening. If you bring these three, together and meditate, the culmination of that is that without stirring from the open expanse of reality that's free from elaboration, the welfare of all living beings throughout space will come about effortlessly and spontaneously. And there's a lot of things like this when I spend time reading these Buddhist texts that spend a fair amount of time trashing the other Buddhists, and sometimes in person and sometimes the views that are held by those other Buddhists. But then when they get around to talking about the practice of the path, they say so many of the same things in so many of the same ways, because they're all Mahayana Buddhist practitioners, right? Yeah. And it's hard not to be impressed by that, right? To see the commonalities are very many. So in terms of realizing the view as part of that path, of course, he's talking about getting rid of the elaborations of the four extremes: existence, non-existence, both, and neither. So he quotes the first verse from Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way. He quotes Aryadeva's explanation of that. And he quotes, apparently this Aryadeva quote is like a thing he quotes over and over again. Yeah. That's really his touchstone. So the view of the ultimate is that which is free from any kind of conceptual construct. Right? Yeah. You can see that wouldn't be something that Tsongkhapa would necessarily say. So if you really understand what these passages from Nagarjuna and Aryadeva are saying, right, and you apply them in your practice, you can transition from the condition that we're in now as ordinary beings who see conventional truths, and that is to see ordinary conventionalities and take them as though they were true, right? And you can transition from that to being an awakened Buddha who directly and non-conceptually realizes the ultimate reality. And so then he has kind of like the stages that you go through to get to there. And, taking the middle bullet point here is you start by identifying and understanding conventional truth. You use logic and reasoning and analysis and meditation. And of course, you're also practicing compassion and the six perfections. And through all this, you gradually begin to realize that the so-called conventional truth is merely conventional, that it's based entirely on concepts rooted in ignorance. And in this way, you come to a conceptual, still conceptual understanding of the ultimate, right? And then through more analysis and deeper yogic practice, you eventually realize that conventional truth is only merely conventional, and you directly realize the ultimate truth, which does not engage with any ignorance or any kind of concepts at all. So he has kind of like a progression that starts, very much as Tsongkhapa says, but then, and then transitions into something that is a non-conceptual realization of the profound reality that liberates us from cyclic existence. So what's the difference? The difference is that he thinks the profound reality that you realize when you go into these non-conceptual yogic meditations is not the same as the emptiness that you're realizing when you're setting out and using logic. And it's like, well, is it the same or is it different? Tsongkhapa is very clear that the object emptiness is the same, and the way in which you're realizing it is different. But Goramba, and I would say not just Goramba, but many other non-Gelugpas, they don't think of it as the same. So we finally get to a state of freedom from conceptual proliferations or elaborations. It's prapancha in Sanskrit. Sometimes people translate it as proliferation, sometimes elaborations. It's like extra stuff that's added on to the way things are. So this is a state in which there's no conceptual thought, and you directly, immediately apprehend the ultimate. So, you know, against the accusation that this is the same as just somebody knocking you over the head and stopping all of your consciousness with a hammer or an uppercut, you know, he said, no, this state of freedom is different from a state of unconsciousness, because in order to attain this freedom from elaborations, you have to eliminate your concepts gradually and systematically through reasoning and logic and meditation, and not just through getting hit in the head. Okay, so we have a little interlude here where I'm going to just show a few pictures of a couple of our teachers that relate to these three views of profound reality. These are I picked out these two pictures of Dolpapa. I don't know, you know, he's our extrinsic emptiness guy. Profound reality is the Buddha. And when he says the Buddha, he doesn't just mean the Dharmakaya or, you know, the nature of reality, which we call Buddha. He means the profound reality is the Buddha, together with all of the marks and characteristics and powers that go along with the Buddha. And that is the profound reality, and everything else is illusory. I don't know if you noticed something in common between these two, this little statue of Dolpapa and the painting here, the Tanka. But what I noticed, comparing him to other things, is that he's kind of big, right? He has some weight there. It's different from how a lot of lamas are portrayed, and yeah, a little bit more going in the direction of you know, Hote or something like that. And this is historically accurate. He was not, you know, big. Tsongkhapa apparently, you know, if you read Jimba's biography, Tsongkhapa, you know, walked from his, you know, homeland in northeastern Tibet, and he walked all the way from there to Lhasa. But that wasn't the way Dolpapa did things. He had to be carried around on a palanquin. And then I thought this is a nice image of Tsongkhapa with Kedrup and Gyaltsap. And for him, the profound reality is a sheer lack of inherent existence. And then we'll come to have a picture of Goramba in a section, but I thought I would just throw in intermediate between Tsongkhapa and Goramba is TAKTSANG, LOTSAWA, SHERAP, RINCHEN, who was you know, also a very famous, he's one of the three most famous Sakya philosophers, and all of whom are sharply critical of Tsongkhapa. You know, you see that TAKTSANG was born 3 years after Tsongkhapa began publishing his works on Madhyamaka. So he overlaps with Tsongkhapa in a way that's a little bit like how Tsongkhapa overlaps with Dolpapa. And we're not going to go into TAKTSANG, you know, but he is kind of interesting. His idea is that he takes a passage from Aryadeva, which I don't have at my fingertips, in which he interprets as meaning that there are three ways to look at things without analysis, to look at things with jungsei cheba, slight analysis, and then look at things with thorough analysis. So the way this relates to Goramba and so forth is when you look at things with no analysis, you see them the way we see them now. When you look at things with slight analysis, I was thinking, you know, when I first read this, I thought, oh, he's talking about realizing impermanence. No, he's talking about realizing emptiness, you know, that slight analysis. So, yeah. And then thorough analysis means this yogic realization of freedom from elaborations that Goramba is talking about. Something that goes beyond understanding emptiness, right? Yeah. So then, yeah, this is Goramba, who's we've been talking about. he's one of the most widely studied philosophers of the Sakya school down to today. He's also now studied in Kagyu and Nyingma. Sometimes Kagyupas and Nyingmas will go to Sakya colleges to study Goramba. In fact, I know a Gelugpa who's done that. But also sometimes Kagyupas and Nyingmas actually have Goramba incorporated into their own curricula, even though he's a Sakya. And as we know, he has a different view of the profound reality. Maybe, I don't, because of some of the things, the ways that Goramba talks about Tsongkhapa and his, encounters with Manjushri through the mediumship of Lama Umapa and the other things that he says about Tsongkhapa, some of which we've seen. Gelugpas were, as they came into political power, were quite horrified with him. And in addition to, putting under seal, locking up Dolpapa's works so they wouldn't, that is, poison people's minds. They also did the same with Goramba's works. And it wasn't until the time of the 13th Dalai Lama that it was interesting, because Goramba is so important, but it only became possible to widely distribute his works and read them in the late 19th century through the influence of the 13th Dalai Lama opening things up. So Tsongkhapa, thinks that Goramba's philosophy negates too much, because if they argue that the final goal of awakening is a complete elimination of concepts, then one ought to be able to attain awakening by simply falling asleep and becoming otherwise unconscious, right? That's an objection that Goramba tried to anticipate. Goramba says that in order to successfully eliminate all concepts in the entirety, you can't just get hit on the head. You actually have to use logic and reasoning to understand the opposite of those concepts. And in that, of course, he agrees with Tsongkhapa. The end result is indeed non-conceptual, but it's very different from, say, the Hoshang character who Tsongkhapa criticizes as just like, going into a state of not thinking. If Buddha has no conceptual thought, if we want to be Buddhas, we should stop thinking, right? And it's quicker that we stop thinking, the better, right? And so Tsongkhapa spends a lot of time showing how problematic that view is. And Goramba does not want to allow his view to be assimilated into that critique. And also Mipam later in the 19th century, the Nyingma philosopher, they emphasized that the use of logic and reasoning is very important in realizing emptiness, even though that isn't the final thing, but it's absolutely a critical thing. And you can read them talking about this, and it's like clear that they're just really deriving this interpretation of the analysis that's necessary to conceptually realize emptiness. It comes out of the Madhyamaka tradition, but it's very much influenced by Tsongkhapa's understanding of the Madhyamaka tradition. They all have read all these books by Tsongkhapa, and they've incorporated his ideas, into their own way of thinking. So, of course, the actual antidote to we suffer needlessly because we don't see things as they are. The actual antidote is direct yogic perception of the profound reality, nirvana, a true cessation. And characteristic of this mind, of course, is the vanishing of all dualistic appearance. What does dualistic appearance mean? Well, it means that, for one thing, it always means in these contexts that there's no aspect of distinction or differentiation between the mind and the object that we're realizing. Most of the time, and I'm not saying like every single minute of our lives, but the vast majority of our time that we're conscious, there is an aspect of our consciousness that is infused with a sense of that there's the object and I'm over here as the subject, and we're not the same thing, right? And So in yogic direct perception, that sense or that sense of the distinction between the subject and object vanishes, right? Also, of course, conceptual thought is associated with dualism because you're getting at your object of understanding through a mental representation of it instead of directly perceiving it, right? So that's a form of dualism. And then associated with that, there's this idea that conceptual thought is associated with the use of signs, that is reified characteristics that the mind grasps onto in things. So, being free from conceptual thought in a way that's attained through this meditative process means also being free from any appearance of the objects that, the object of your mind as inherently existing. So in other words, you're realizing only emptiness, nothing else but emptiness in this state. Or if you're in GORAMPA's system, you're realizing nothing but freedom from extremes. And that is not appearing in any way dualistically. You're not seeing yourself as separate from it. You don't have a conception of it or any reified notion of it. So for TSONGKHAPA, emptiness is the object realized there in this path of seeing and so forth. But the mind, this mind does not know itself as a realizer of emptiness. I mentioned doesn't know this yogic meditative equipoise on emptiness does not recognize itself as a knower of emptiness. It does not recognize the existence of emptiness because those things are conventional truths. And so those are understood by reflecting back on your experience after you emerge from meditation. In the meditative equipoise itself, only emptiness appears, right? Like water poured into water, they always say. It's an empty mind knowing emptiness. So it knows its own, mind realizing emptiness is knowing its own basic nature, not knowing it as something separate from, not knowing emptiness as something separate from itself. So when you think about that, you say, what if, this ultimate consciousness that it is the antidote to cyclic existence, doesn't this, from the point of view of that ultimate consciousness, there isn't any distinction between the ultimate consciousness and the object it realizes. That distinction exists only when you're outside of that mind, right? Either before or after, right? And so if you think about that, you can understand that it's not entirely insane that other systems would, talk about the profound reality in a way that doesn't constitute it as a sheer negation, because they're seeing it as a non-duality of a subjective awareness, a subjective wisdom, a Buddha wisdom, an exalted wisdom, right? And the object that it's knowing. And these are right together and experienced as indistinguishable, right? And it's not like the mind realizing emptiness is thinking, oh, I finally got hold of this sheer negation. Do you see what I'm saying? So of course, TSONGKHAPA's system would say, no, you really have to still keep in mind that emptiness is a sheer negation. Did somebody say something? Okay.
Oh, because yes, you were on that chart, and I just had a question on the bullet point where about the mind not realizing itself as the real. Is that whole idea in Prasangika about refuting self-reflexive awareness?
It's related to it. So yeah. So Chandrakirti has an elaborate critique of Rangrik, or Svasamvedana in Sanskrit, reflexive awareness. And most of these other systems, say that Chandrakirti was only intending to refute reflexive awareness as truly existent or ultimately existent. And they they really want to hold on to reflexive self-awareness as something that's a conventional starting point for all understanding. But Tsongkhapa takes the starting point for all knowledge that we have as being our ordinary unimpaired sense perception. And then based on that, we get, you know, conventionally correct ideas through reasoning, right? Right. But it starts with unimpaired sense perception of the world around us. But, you know, if you read Mipam or Goramba, these other people there, they think that it really starts with reflexive self-awareness, which is in some sense even more fundamental than sense perception. It's always right there together with your mind. And this serves, this self-reflective awareness sort of functions in some other Dharma traditions as kind of a precursor of exalted wisdom. It's like a kind of, yeah, it's a sort of a fundamental kind of awareness that's always with us. Yeah. But no, what I was trying to say is that the mind, that the fact of the mind knowing emptiness is not emptiness. The fact of emptiness existing is not emptiness. So those aren't things that the mind realizing emptiness can know. Let's see. I have some translations from Jangya. So here we have a later Gelugpa, and I have a little bit of this and a little bit of Mipam, and then I'll wrap up. So this is a poem, but this translation, I just ignored all the poetry aspect of it. It's through the kindness of my old mother only that I can hope to gain liberation. If all dualistic appearance is really just as it seems, then even the Buddhas of the 3 times have no way to save me. So of course, by the old mother, he means, you know, emptiness or wisdom, realizing empty, the perfection of wisdom, right? The mother means perfection of wisdom. If this changing variety is my changeless mother's expression, then there is indeed a cause of liberation. Yeah, so he's talking about the relationship between dependent arising and emptiness. If dependent arising is really the expression of profound emptiness, then it's possible that we can be liberated. Mother, inexpressible, not established anywhere. Father, mutual dependence in disguise everywhere. This very dependence has deep significance. Not finding my father when sought is actually to have found my mother. In other words, when you try to pin down and analyze exactly how dependent arising works, the fact that it cannot be pinned down, just like anything else, is because it doesn't inherently exist. That is finding the mother, realizing emptiness. So yeah, that's, you know, this is a person who's practicing a Gelugpa way of understanding emptiness. There's Jangya. He apparently spent most of his life in China as an advisor to the emperor there. Very good writer. And then from the same poem, he's talking about everybody else. Many Sakya, Nyingma, Kagyu, and Drukpa scholars use terms such as reflexive awareness of emptiness and clarity that is free of grasping, or the true face of Samantabhadra that is pristine purity and spontaneity, where we know from earlier class that Samantabhadra is a way of talking about basic goodness. Primordial Buddha nature is basically good. Mahamudra that is innate and uncontrived, like the mind as a fundamental Vajra, and free of assertions such as existent or non-existent. That obviously refers to Goramba's Sakya view. Saying all these kinds of things, they boastfully utilize various labels. If this helps them destroy the essence of inherent existence, it's fine. In other words, we don't care what they call it and how they talk about it, as long as it's helping them to get rid of their attachment to inherent nature. But what's really the point they're aiming at, right? So yeah, he doesn't tell what he thinks the answer is, but he's saying that you can talk about it any way you want, but it has to come down to refuting inherent existence, or you're not really going to have a path to liberation. This is Mipam. Let's see. Oh, that is Mipam, but he shouldn't have been there because I'm still in the Jangya quote. Nowadays, some of our hopeful thinkers, our own hopeful thinkers means Gelugpas. Now some of our Gelugpa scholars cling to terms such as able to withstand analysis or truly established, so that it seems, while leaving vivid appearances intact, they search for something with horns to negate. It's very important, and it relates to a point that I've made in the earlier class. Here's a Gelugpa saying that the Gelugpa medicine, Dharma medicine, like any other medicine, has potential downside. And that is, people will be refuting inherent existence, which is something that they never knew about in the first place. But they'll learn, you know, oh yeah, these appearances are the way they are because of inherent existence. And they'll refute inherent existence, putting on a horn and then cutting it off again. And they leave appearances unchallenged, just as they are. He's saying, you know, that's the problem with our own scholasticism in Gelugpa. In my mother's face, free from obstructions, vivid dualistic appearances are not found, I'm told. Too much talk without touching the point to be negated will make my mother run away, I fear. Existent things exist, though not as they appear right now. Okay, well, he's made his point. It's rather beautiful. And then we have His Holiness. And then we have a little bit of Mipam. So Mipam is, lived into the 20th century. He's, as I mentioned, the greatest Nyingma philosopher. A lot of the Nyingmapas have never had any pretense to be philosophers and didn't care to be. But there are a few, Rongzom, Longchenpa, and Mipam are the names. And it's clear that Mipam, also the most recent one, is the greatest of them. And, he's interested in the tension between the things that Tsongkhapa has said and the things that he finds in the Dzogchen tradition of Nyingma. Yeah, and he tries to reconcile these things. He doesn't try to say, oh yeah, all that stupid Gelugpa stuff is superseded when you really understand Dzogchen. He doesn't really say it like that. He more says, if you really understand Dzogchen and you really understand, philosophical reasoning of Madhyamaka, you see them as non-contradictory. And he spends quite a bit of time in his text talking about logic and reason in a way that's, well, it's not in Longchenpa anyway. I haven't read a lot of Nyingma texts, but I have read Longchenpa, and his texts do not strike me as really philosophical, but more as mystical, and they don't have analysis in them as far as I can see. Mipam is very much interested in analysis, and he does make this criticism of Gelugpa that when you look at a pot, and you say, well, I'm not going to really refute that pot because Tsongkhapa said that as valid conventional existence, but I'm going to refute this other thing, the inherent existence of the pot. He's saying, well, that's a problem because you really haven't challenged the way these appearances are to your mind. You've left it unscathed. And that's the same point that Jangya was making as like a potential pitfall within the Gelugpa path. So to say that the ultimate is authentic experience and to say that it's the object of that experience, these are the two things I was talking about before, right? These are just different contextually according to Mipam. The first way of talking, say that ultimate is, primordial wisdom, this corresponds to an experience in meditative equipoise, right? And the other way of talking about it as the object of experience, it relates to analysis. He says the analysis of your experience after meditation. But maybe he could have said, you know, the analysis of how things exist leading up to your, but anyway, clearly after you emerge from meditation, right, then you can say, oh, I realize this object emptiness, which corresponds to the object that I realized through Madhyamaka reasoning. But when you try to describe, when you try to talk about the actual antidote and what it's like subjectively, there's a kind of distortion. This is the non-Gelugpa critique, right? There's a distortion when you say the ultimate mind is non-dualistic, and then you say, but we're going to tell you what its object is and what its subject is. Well, the ultimate mind, you know, is not one that makes that distinction. So maybe we could have a philosophy that takes into account or foregrounds the perspective of exalted wisdom, which is non-dualistic, rather than Tsongkhapa's way, which says, well, you know, we're going to talk with words, so let's talk with, you know, with words and categories, and these aren't going to arise, of course, in you know, a non-dualistic mind realizing emptiness, but this is how we have to talk, right? That's how we talk. And I mean, that's why I like it, because it's like, we are all talking, we are all thinking. And it's like, it doesn't help me to just say, okay, well, there's this thing and we can't really talk about it, but that's the real thing. We can talk, but we can't talk about the real thing, right? Yeah. So there's some excerpts from famous text by Mipam, which is also poetry, Sword of Wisdom. Through the power of scriptures on reality and reasoning that refutes all extremes and personal instruction from a spiritual teacher, the light will come to you like sight to the blind, and you'll reach final understanding of all things without exception as equal, while you thereby gain definite assurance that they are also inexpressible. It's still skillful to express the inexhaustible Dharma treasury, right? We're going to have to keep talking, even though the Dharma that we're talking about is inexpressible. If you gain skill in how the two truths work, you come to see the meaning of their inextricable union. And at that point, as though stripping the husk to get at the kernel, you see that all Buddhist methods are aiming at this very point, and the flow of your great compassion spreads without strain, extending to the farthest reaches of space and time. Right? So these people are all read Shantideva, you know, they're all Mahayana Buddhists. They all have this kind of similar spiritual vision. And so I'm gonna close with a couple slides on this guy, Tenzin Gyatso. So these quotes are from his book, Kindness, Clarity, and Insight. And I'm not going to try to explain to you everything he does in the book. I'm just going to tell you that if you want to go further in exploring how the Dalai Lama talks about the relationship between Nyingma and Dzogchen on the one hand, and Madhyamaka as interpreting Gelugpa, the place to start is the book Kindness, Clarity, and Insight, and especially the last essay in that book, which is challenging. But there are other texts too, but this is a place to start. So earlier in that book, he says, the conventional nature of the mind is clear light, and thus defilements do not reside in the nature of the mind. But from the ultimate point of view, the nature of the mind is emptiness of inherent existence. So he sets this up, and I've heard him talk about it before, is that, look, the conventional nature of the mind and the ultimate nature of the mind are you know, one entity. They're one entity. They're always right there together, right? And so maybe since the conventional nature of the mind is clear light, right? And defilements don't reside in even the conventional nature of the mind, right? And the ultimate nature of the mind is the stainlessness of emptiness. Then maybe it's a little, maybe it's not so important to get into an argument about whether the ultimate is a non-affirming negative or a sheer negation, or whether it's can be talked about as a consciousness that understands the profound reality non-dualistically. In daily practice, it's helpful to identify the conventional nature of the mind and concentrate on it. And it's hard to do this because it's covered over by our conceptions. And so he gives it a little instruction, you know, stop thinking about the past, stop thinking about the future, just let the mind flow of its own accord without any conceptual overlay, and then let the mind rest in its natural state and observe it. And in the beginning, this is quite difficult to do, but in time, the mind appears like clear water. Then just stay with this unfabricated mind without allowing conceptions to be generated. So, you know, I'm purposely picking out, you know, quotes from very ordinary public lectures about, you know, meditation and the nature of Buddhist practice that His Holiness has given, where if you just took them out of context, you might think that they were coming from Mipam or somebody. Whereas Mipam, if you pick the right passages, you can see him talking about the logic and the importance of understanding conventionality. The tantric focus on letters or light at important places in the body serves as a mean of forcefully stopping conceptuality. Because within consciousness, there are many levels, from the gross to the subtle. And in highest yoga mantra, the subtler levels are transformed into wisdom, you know, when we access these by stopping conceptual thought. And then in the end, the last chapter, the last last essay in Kindness, Clarity, and Insight, he starts by saying, for a long time, I've had a one-pointed belief that the Nyingma, Sakya, and Kagyu Gelug traditions are all unions of sutra and mantra, as well as being consequent school, Prasangika, Madhyamika, in terms of their view of emptiness. Right? So that's, yeah, he's not saying this is the official Gelugpa view. He doesn't say that's Tsongkhapa's view. He says, this is my view. And it has been for a long time. It's a little hard for him to prove that his view is justifiable. And that's why it's complicated and takes up, you know, it's a little bit long essay. But just a couple of excerpts from him. He says, the Kagyu stems from Marpa and Milarepa. And Milarepa says that even though the Buddha is the truth body, the grounds and path, and so forth, even emptiness are not ultimately existent, right? None of these things are ultimately existent, but within the scope of non-analysis and non-investigation, everything exists for a conventional consciousness. So he takes the kinds of, you know, poetry that you get in the Kagyu tradition, and he shows how it can at least be reasonably understood to be non-contradictory to Tsongkhapa's way of explaining that all phenomena, even emptiness, do not exist ultimately, but, you know, when not subject to analysis or scrutiny searching for the true nature, everything exists conventionally. Thus, Milarepa advocated a non-confusion among dependent arisings in the sphere of the conventional, and at the same time, the non-findability of even emptiness ultimately, right? And therefore, he's going to say the Kagyu tradition in its roots is fundamentally compatible with, So you notice that, you know, the Kagyupa tradition today has a huge influence from Jonangpa and ideas about extrinsic emptiness. So he's not quoting those influences, right? He's not saying, you know, in the Kagyupa tradition, there's this idea of extrinsic emptiness and that came from Dolpapa, and that idea is the same as Tsongkhapa. He doesn't say that at all. He goes back to Milarepa and he says, you know, in the roots of the Kagyupa tradition, and I'm going to put in brackets, before they got tangled up with Dolpapa, right, they had a view that was completely consistent with what Tsongkhapa clarified later in more technical language, you could say. Then in the Sakya school, he says, differs slightly in emphasis and choice of terminology. Well, you know, having read what we've just been looking at, you can see that it's not just some different words. They also can, you know, be quite sharply critical. And the other way too. Kedra says that Rendawa and Tsongkhapa differ in words, but are getting at the same thing, and their basic thought is the same. And then Nyingma is this is what he says, in the most of the chapter is about this. He says, the real problem is not Sakya or Kagyu. I mean, he sort of dispensed with the Kagyu being extrinsic emptiness problem by, ignoring the whole Dolpapa system and just focusing on Milarepa. It's difficulty to see similarity in view is with Nyingma. And then he says, the roots of Nyingma are valid and accord with reality. And even Tsongkhapa recognized this. He had a teacher, Tsongkhapa had a Nyingma teacher who taught him Dzogchen. There are many who ascended to the level of adept independence on the Nyingma path. This is one of his main arguments. He's saying, look, we know that there's awakened beings, there's realized beings who've been practicing Dzogchen. You don't want to say that these people are not realized beings because it seems clear that they are. And therefore they must have something, some way that they're getting at the same fundamental wisdom that we are. The first Panchen Lama says that although the schools, including Nyingma, use different words, when an experienced yogi analyzes them, they all come down to the same thought. Then later on, and he brings this up, the first Panchen Lama's statement to this effect that, even Nyingma and Gelugpa, if understood by an adept yogi, will see that they come down to the same thing and just differ terminologically. It was said that he just said this for political reasons, right? It's a political statement, not a genuinely philosophical statement, right? But what His Holiness tries to do is to provide some kind of explanation of how that could be true, right? In Nyingma, the view of Dzogchen is an affirming negative, not an utter negation, right? But a negation of, inherent existence combined with the presence of the wisdom mind. I've given much consideration to how these presentations could be coming down to the same thing. And my thought on this is based on the work of a Nyingma master, Dodruchen, who I've heard him talk about before. But having looked at what he says about this and considering, where we are in this class, I have decided to just point you at his essay rather than trying to explain it. It's not straightforward or easy for me to summarize. So that's what I'm going to end with, is pointing you back to the words of His Holiness, who is, he's not the head of the Gelugpa order, right? He's a Gelugpa monk, but his job is not to be a partisan advocate, even though he's a dedicated follower of Tsongkhapa. He works extremely hard and extremely well at trying to find deep connections, not by falsifying things. Like if somebody's really saying something different, like extrinsic emptiness, he doesn't say it's the same, right? Yeah. Or if somebody has a cultural tradition where human sacrifice is a good thing, he's not going to say, yeah, but it really comes down to the same thing, right? Yeah. But on the other hand, he wants to look for where the heart of kindness and wisdom can be found in other traditions, not just in his own. Exactly. And yeah, that's why I'm a big fan. I'm finally going to stop talking.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Or two? I have two questions. Please take them as you would. One question is that you mentioned that Gorampa said that logic and reasoning can lead to non-conceptuality. I would like to know, in summary or in brief, what that analysis is. And the second question is that for the life of me, I couldn't quite understand how the mind seeing the flower and the flower can be non-dual. Is there any explanation of that, or it is inexpressible, according to the people who advocate this?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the first problem that you raise is one that, you know, the Madhyamaka tradition, let's just say, the Madhyamaka tradition, Buddhapalita, Bhavaviveka, Chandrakirti, Tsongkhapa, Goramba, all of these people have been dealing with for a long time, is that we start out thinking about the nature of reality, and we end up in this kind of utterly non-conceptual wisdom state that functions as nirvana, you know, and an actual antidote. And how do you get from talking and thinking to some kind of direct experience like that, right? They all have the same issue, and the question is like, how are you going to work that? And one way is to talk about, you know, sort of like honorary ultimates and real ultimates. And that's what Goramba was doing. He's saying, well, you know, there's kind of a something we call the ultimate that you realize conceptually, but it's not the real ultimate, right? Because that's only realized non-dualistically later on. And that idea of like distinguishing between the ultimate that you can realize conceptually and the ultimate that's realized in sublime wisdom, it goes back to Bhavaviveka, you know, who was trying to, trying to explain how this takes place. Now, in Tsongkhapa's way, the way it takes place is that you form a inferential, through analysis, logic, and reasoning about how things are empty, you arrive at an inferential understanding of that utter lack of inherent existence. And when that understanding is stable enough that you can rest in it and it doesn't just evaporate like poof as soon as you stop doing the reasoning, then you use whatever practice of concentration you've developed to try to stabilize your mind on that understanding of emptiness. And so, as Tsongkhapa describes in great treatise, when you first start to do this, as soon as you start to meditate on emptiness, the object, which is your conceptual understanding of emptiness, evaporates because the force of the prior reasoning isn't still there. So then you have to go back and reason again to reestablish the clarity of your conceptual understanding of emptiness. And then you have to focus your mind one-pointedly on it again. And you do that over and over and over and over until you can stabilize your mind one-pointedly on this conceptual still conceptual, dualistic in that sense, but you're stabilizing your mind one-pointedly on this understanding of emptiness.
I'm sorry, I meant Gorampa or these other people's explanation of non-conceptual.
No, you said that actually. So I just
non-duality.
Yeah, well, it's not what I'm saying. I'm explaining Tsongkhapa's because essentially it's not that different. I mean, what his idea, I don't know if you've heard of the Western philosophical tradition of skepticism, but in skepticism, the idea is that you will reach a state called ataraxia, which is a state of freedom from all views. You won't be attached to any view whatsoever. And how do you reach this freedom from all views is you systematically and repeatedly refute any possible view that you might be tempted to hold until you're left in a kind of position where you've sort of realized that there isn't any position left to be held whatsoever. That seems to be a bit how Goramba envisions this, you know, that you don't just refute, you don't just realize emptiness, you realize the absence of being and the absence of non-being and the absence of both and the absence of neither. And through that, you attain to kind of like an understanding that's liberated from any kind of conceptual extreme. That's how he describes it.
and his analysis of how to reach non-conceptuality? I mean, what kind of analysis did he?
You mean that he uses, it's the same, right? The five, all the you know, all the same arguments that are used in there. It's Madhyamaka, right? It's all the same arguments. It's he's just going to use those arguments to clear the ground for then, you know, overcoming all conceptual proliferations, not just proliferations of true existence, you know, but proliferations of existence, proliferations of non-existence, both and neither. And when you use logic and reason to clear all these away, you open up a space where, you know, your mind rests in something that transcends attachment to any extreme. So he uses the word extreme and the word proliferation basically as the same thing, that as soon as we think about something and try to categorize it as up or down, good or bad, empty or non-empty, you know, deficient or complete, as soon as we think about something and categorize it, we're elaborating or proliferating, you know, like in a Baroque style, you could say, and not just leaving the sheer simplicity of things just as they are, right? And that this can be done in any kind of direction. And so when you do that, you, in Gorampa's view, you always fall to an extreme, one extreme or another. And so you transcend that by systematically refuting all extremes, not just the extreme of things having true existence. Now, you seeing the flower. Okay, so when I look at the flower, I have this distinctly dualistic sense that I am looking at the flower. And even though I'm not thinking I'm looking at the flower, I'm just like seeing the flower. Even my sense perception is infused with a sense of dualism. And so
because the flower and I are separate.
Yeah.
We're two objects. We are different.
Right.
As in Tibetan say, tade, different.
Yeah,
so
tate.
How
Right,
do
I
you
heard
make
you.
two different things to be non-dual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, so you could say like this. TSONGKHAPA says that conventional difference between me and emptiness is real and valid. And if it really were real and valid, why wouldn't it be realized as real and valid by the sublime wisdom on the path of seeing? But the sublime wisdom of the path of seeing does not realize all true facts. It just realizes emptiness. This is the answer for TSONGKHAPA. It's like, yeah, there's a difference between you and the flower that exists conventionally. It just happens to be that that's not something that the ultimate wisdom consciousness sees. It sees emptiness.
I can understand TSONGKHAPA's explanation of non-duality in that in emptiness, you know, the emptiness of the flower and my emptiness, they are one taste. They are one taste and therefore non-dual. I can understand that explanation, but I get the sense that for other masters like Gorampa or the others, it give me the sense that they are talking about literally my mind and the flower become one. So maybe I'm misunderstanding it. So I'm trying to understand in what way they explain this non-duality. Like in Yogacara, they say that the mind and the object come from the same seed from the Alaya Vishnanath. So that is their explanation. Yeah. So Gorampa, what is his explanation of non-duality of object?
I think I can answer it. So, you know, there's a question of balancing how much ontological reality are you going to attribute to the conventional, and how much reality are you going to put on the side of the ultimate? And as compared to other Tibetan systems, TSONGKHAPA puts more emphasis on the side of conventional reality. And and less on the idea, ultimate reality. In other words, emptiness is not any more real than flowers or consciousnesses of flowers. They're all equally real. And you're used to thinking that way as I am. There's only one kind of reality, and that's conventional reality. That's Tsongkhapa's view. But that's not how everybody else sees it. People tend to consider that what we're seeing now is false and delusory. Now, how false and how delusory differs between, say, Dolpapa, who thinks it's completely false and delusory, and Goramba, on the other hand. You know, there's a spectrum of how much weight are you going to put on the ultimate. But basically, Goramba is calling Tsongkhapa a nihilist, not because he's too nihilistic about flowers and peoples and tables. It's because he thinks he's not giving enough oomph of reality to the ultimate side, right? And so when you give some extra real with a capital R to the ultimate side, it stresses the deceptive or delusory aspect of the conventional. If you look at the way Chandrakirti, for example, talks about the conventional truth, and then you look at the way Tsongkhapa describes conventional truth based on that, it always incorporates an idea of deceptiveness, not just okayness for conventional minds, but okayness for conventional minds because conventional minds are messed up. So the word, you know, Gunsob Demba in Tibetan, you know, which we usually translate as conventional truth. Well, it's the most common term in Tibetan for conventional truth, right? It doesn't mean true in a pretty good, okay, conventional sense. This is how we usually take it, right? It's true. Why? Because it's conventional truth, and therefore it's true. That's not actually, even Tsongkhapa will say, conventional truths are characterized by their deceptive nature. They don't exist as they appear. You can't just go around talking about them as valid conventionally and think that that's the whole story. You have to remember that they're pervasively appearing in a way that's different from how they exist, okay? So Tsongkhapa, I want to give him more credit than later Gelugpas for preserving that understanding of the conventional. He wants to make sure that we understand that it exists, but at the same time, he stresses this deceptive quality. And it's embedded, you know, in the true. Gunsob Dhamma means a truth for concealing ignorance, something that an ignorant mind would take to be true, right? That's what the term means. It doesn't mean something that's legitimately established in a practical sense. That's not what it says. Yeah. So there's a way in which you can write a whole essay about the way in which conventional truth is truth, and another whole essay about the way in which it's falsity. Because the Gelugpa text will say conventional truth is synonymous with falsity, meaning something that does not exist as it appears, right? And if you keep remembering that, then you get Jangya's point when he's talking about, you know, the problem in Gelugpa by stressing so hard the reality of conventional things like tables and chairs. They get people feeling safe and secure that their ordinary appearances of tables and chairs are unscathed by Madhyamaka analysis. And that's not the case.
I understand what Tsongkhapa is getting at. And that's not, I don't know how we get here, but that wasn't my question. So it's okay. Other people probably have questions. So
I don't know. I tried to get to the question as best I could. You can send me an email. Send me an email.
Yeah, thank you.
We'll try some more.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I could B is a deep thinker who's been engaged with the tradition for a long time. Knows some, yeah, Tibetan too. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, maybe about self-awareness, wrong, Rick. I don't really understand how some thinkers seem to posit it as linked or related to a yogic experience.
Yeah, yeah. So this is really important. Maybe a way to think about it is to say, you know, what is, if you're talking in a tantric context, you know, or a context where tantra and sutra are being fused, you know, you can talk about, as His Holiness just did in that public lecture, that the conventional nature of the mind is clear light. But of course, you know, that's not really the Madhyamaka Sutra Shastra way of talking. The thing that seems to function for, you know, in Yogacara is this sort of, there's a fundamental mind, which is conflated to some extent with the mind basis of all, which carries the seeds. But then some other people say, look, the fundamental mind is not the mind basis of all, because that's, you know, involved with karma. So then there's this idea that there's this fundamental mind-like thing, an ultimate that's like the pristine wisdom that's always there. And it's kind of analogous in some way to the continuum of the, you know, the mind basis of all, the alaya. But it's maybe, depending on the teacher, identify with that or not. And then that would be in Yogacara, but in Madhyamaka, then you don't have that, right? So how, if they're not talking about clear light in a sutra-based shastra, and they're not talking about the mind basis of all, because that's the Yogacara system, then what do they talk about as the way that we always have right with us some sort of reflexive awareness that's always there, you know, that's a basic continuum of mind. And it seems that Rangrik, you know, reflexive self-awareness serves that function for some teachers. It's like, I don't know, I might be stretching a point too far, but, you know, in the Gelugpa system, how do you get from here to there involves reasoning and logic and conceptual thought and various gradual steps. But in some other systems, the idea is that there's an innate wisdom that's always with us, right? And that we just have to clear away the clouds of dualistic thought, and it immediately shines forth and we can relax into it, right? And this is where Rangrik, you know, comes into play and gets, I want to say, it gets promoted from just being something that explains how we can remember what it felt like to see the flower, which was kind of the original idea, right? We remember not just seeing the flower, we remember what it felt like to see the flower. Why? Because there was a consciousness when we were seeing the flower that was aware not only of the flower, but it was aware of ourselves as the seer of the flower. And that's why we can remember ourselves as the seer of the flower, right? So that was the original, you know, function of reflective self-awareness. And it gets promoted from that to being kind of like the continuously subtle mind that's always there, right? And aware of everything that's going on with us all the time, and can be, uncovered and revealed as the pristine wisdom. And there's a lot of texts, and which we didn't get into, that talk about exactly what you're saying, that Rangrik is not just something that explains memories of past subjective experiences. It functions, I'm going to say homologously, you know, to conceptual thought, conceptual reasoning into emptiness is the passageway in Gelugpa from here to enlightenment. But what's the passageway, you know, in these other systems is that it's accessing our primordial wisdom, and you talking about that in terms of this reflexive self-awareness that's always pervasively present, yeah, but we're not aware of it being present, but we can become aware of it if we clear away the clouds of dualistic conceptions, right? So that's, yeah, that's the best I can do with it, not having studied those systems extensively, but there is a lot written about it. Matthew Kapstein is a great scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, and he's written a lot about this.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
Matthew, yeah.
So shall we, it's been a long evening. We've gone way past what, 8:30. So thank you guys. It's really wonderful teaching. We hope you'll come back. Thank you, everybody.
I had a lot of fun.
Really
Thank you so
appreciate
much
it.
for
Thank
taking
you.
all our questions.
Yeah, I'm happy. Thank you for listening so well. Yeah. Well, we, yeah, let's dedicate all the merit of all these teachings that we've listened to and participate in to the welfare of all living beings. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. And we hope you'll come back very soon.
Yeah, I hope that works out. Yeah, and maybe next time it will be, yeah, in person.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Okay.
That would be great.
Yes.
Thank
you so
you.
much. Thank you,
for
everybody.
inviting me.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye.